kind of loud noises in the background because I'm in my office and there's no little rooms to go to, and it's a big open plan office. So hopefully no one will come and ask me a question in the middle. Okay, so when Rocio and Luke and Chelsea and Andres and Rebecca asked me to give a talk at the end of the series this year, I thought, well, what should I talk about? I could talk about, all kinds of things. So I thought I would just talk about something that I'm working on now that isn't quite finished, but that I think is amazing. So I thought I would talk about the black nightshades, which everybody thinks of these as being weeds, but I actually think that they're wonders. So I've already answered the question, so everyone can just go home now. But first, before I start out to talk about black nightshades, I'd just like to thank everybody on this slide and a whole bunch more people, because without the group of people who work on Solanaceae and the group of us all working together, all trading ideas, criticizing each other's ideas, really thinking about what we're doing, we wouldn't have made as much progress in Solanaceae taxonomy, biodiversity, systematics, phylogeny, biochemistry, evolution and development. All of those things, all of the progress that has come in those things comes from having a community that shares and collaborates really well. So I just want to thank all of these people up front. Now, because I know that these seminars are on YouTube and people look at them after, I'm just going to start with a little bit of background just to set the scene so that anybody who's coming into this, not having come to every single one of these seminars up to now, will know where we're starting from. Solanaceae is a fascinating family. It's the best family of angiosperms. There are more than 100 genera, and there's only about 4,000 species, which means it's not one of the really big families like orchids or composites, which have about 32,000 species in them, but it's sort of a middling sized family of flowering plants. But it is unusual in that about half of the species diversity in the family is contained within a single genus, the genus Solanum. Now, there are other big genera like Cestrum and Lisianthes, which have about 200 species. And then there's lots and lots of really small genera. And there are a lot of genera which have a single species. So these are lineages which have not diversified at all. And that's one of the really interesting things about the family, in a way, is that it has an interesting broad combination of lineages which have diversified massively and lineages which have not diversified at all. So Solanum, with its 1,250 plus, more or less, kind of species, is an extraordinary genus, and it basically lives everywhere. Everywhere from the driest deserts on the coasts of South America to very, very high elevations in the Andes and in the Himalayas. These are almost as dry as deserts sometimes, to the savannas and plains of Africa, and to the Australian outback, the deserts of the center of Australia in the Aremian zone. But the highest diversity of species in Solanum occurs on the eastern slopes of the Andes, in those wet areas where all of the clouds which are coming across the Amazon basin, gathering water, just get backed up against the Andes and just drop it all. So it's incredibly wet habitat. So that's where the highest species diversity of Solanum is, and interestingly, the highest species diversity of Solanaceae as well. And so people who know me will know that, but I think this is true of all of us who work in taxonomy and systematics, is that there's kind of two strands to what we do. And the first of these, I think, can be encapsulated in Linnaeus's aphorism: if you do not know the names of things, the knowledge of them is lost too. Is we name things, we delimit species, we delimit genera, we look at lineages and give them names. But we give them names, not to become famous, but to actually be able to talk about them. So giving names to something is really, really important. The other thing that people like us do is we look at the relationships between those things that we've given names to. So this is a paper that was led by Tiina Sarkkinen a few years ago, well, quite a while ago now, which is a phylogenetic framework for the nightshades. And a bunch of us participated in this paper. And this was the first dated phylogeny for the family. Now that work is being redone as we speak, which is really, really exciting. So I think having thrown something out there and said, okay, here we go, here's a whole bunch of dates and here's how things are connected, what it's done is stimulated more work. So in this phylogeny, which kind of goes from here to here to here in a kind of zigzaggy sort of way, the far right lineage, this one, is the genus Solanum. So the genus Solanum, according to our dating, which is certainly too young, is about 20 million years old. So it's an explosive radiation in relatively recent times. Now, Solanum has been known for its kind of basic floral plan, which has these 5 stamens in the middle and a 5-parted corolla. But because of the variations in anthropomorphology, a lot of these things have been described as other genera previously. But work done in Lynn Bose's lab basically showed that Solanum, including all of these other things, is a monophyletic lineage with 100% support. So this is a phylogeny after Lynn and Terry Weiss's paper from 2007, and all of these clades here are the clades of Solanum. So Solanum itself, even though there are these things which people have segregated off, either because they're economically important or because they have strange anthers and something slightly off morphologically about them, really are a whole genus that we now recognize as a monophyletic Solanum. Now, how do you decide what to call a genus? Now, deciding what to call a genus can be quite tricky. So part of what deciding to call a genus is where you cut your phylogenetic tree. So where you take those scissors and cut the tree is your decision about what the genus is going to be. And so this is a balance, as is much of taxonomy, between the pragmatic and the perfect. So you need to be able to recognize things. And those flowers of Solanum are pretty recognizable, even the ones that have slightly odd anthers. So we decided, as a whole group of people working on Solanum, is to cut our Solanum here. We could alternatively have decided to cut it where the fat red line is, and then we would have had something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 genera, some of which had names, some of which didn't have names, but actually diagnosing them and figuring out what they are would have been extremely difficult because they don't really share, not all of them share unique characters that would allow us to diagnose them. So we've decided as a community working on Solanum to have a monophyletic, great big Solanum. But that in itself comes with problems. So Solanum's always been a big genus. It was one of the biggest genera in Linnaeus's species Plantarum. He recognized 23 species. And in 1768, Philip Miller, who wrote the Gardener's Dictionary, which was kind of one of the great taxonomic works of the latter part of the 18th century, he said, the trouble with Linnaeus's Solanum is that it's way too big. So I've segregated all these things off to be different things. And that's where Lycopersicon came in. And potatoes were actually part of Lycopersicon at the time. But people started adding more and more species to Solanum. So you can see how the numbers keep going up. And the really big jump was here at the very first part of the 19th century. And that coincides with the exploration, the beginning of the botanical exploration of tropical South America. So that's really when the species numbers started to go up in Solanum. And we reckon we thought there were probably 1,500 species. We now recognize about 1,243 or 44 or 46, depending on which ones have been published yet or not. But essentially this means there are lots and lots and lots of species. There are also lots and lots of names. So our big problem, one of our big problems in Solanum, which is kind of different to many of the other big genera that there are in angiosperms, is synonymy. So the thing is, in Solanum, there are about 8,000 names. About 1,246 of these are accepted, which means there's almost 6,000 synonyms. So names which are perfectly validly published and usable, but we can't use because we think that they belong to something that has a name which is earlier than that. So that means we have about an 80% synonymy rate. Now that's very high for angiosperms, and that can be largely attributed to the fact that there are plants of economic importance like Solanum lycopersicum and Solanum tuberosum, and also some European species which also have synonymy problems, which I'll talk about in a minute. So synonymy, so it's not so much an exciting game of finding new species, it's an exciting game of figuring out how to deal with all of these names, which can be equally fun because it's like a puzzle. You follow a thread until it gets to an answer. So Solanums have a huge diversity of body shapes. They come in tiny little herbaceous plants. That's my thumb holding Solanum wedelii from the high Andes in Argentina. They can be quite big trees. This is Solanum denicense in Kenya. They can also be big trees in South America with massively great fruits. This is Solanum lycocarpum from Brazil. So some of the huge diversity of body shapes in Solanum is partly what makes it exciting to work on. It also occurs everywhere in the world. This is a different view of that figure from Tina's paper from 2013. And the Solanums can essentially be divided into two basic groups of things, which have been recognized for a really, really long time. We have the spiny Solanums, which actually are the prickly Solanums, but we all call them the spiny Solanums for some reason, is the prickly Solanums, which are a monophyletic group and are about half the species diversity of Solanum over here. And then we have the non-spiny solanums, which are a grade. They're not a clade, they're a paraphyletic group, but they lack spines. So they're a grade, and they occur all over the world. That all these are colored the way you can see on the side, but one of these really big ones is this large monophyletic group of Eastern Hemisphere solanums. We now call them the Eastern Hemisphere spiny clade, because I decided that Old World sounded too neo-colonial, so they're called Eastern Hemisphere now. But those are a really interesting one, and those who've heard seminars that I've given in this series before on the work that Susie Echeverria Londoño did as part of her PhD, is that species richness of Solanum is largely concentrated in South America, but the net diversification, or the speciation, the high speciation rate in Solanum is actually concentrated in that Eastern Hemisphere spiny clade, largely in Africa and in Australia. So I'm not going to talk about that anymore because that's a previous seminar in this series, but I wanted to highlight Susie's work, and you know, we can go back and do more on this in the future within each of those lineages. So all of this work in Solanum, in these big genera, actually depends a lot on working in the field. This is Paul Gonzalez and Tina Sarkinen, both of whom are in another online seminar series about biodiversity in the Marañón Valley in Peru today, so they can't be with us. But also it depends upon working in the herbarium. And this is Maria Baden, who's databasing specimens in the herbarium in Trujillo. So having those two important considerations of knowing plants in the field and also knowing their distributions from the herbarium has been really important to understanding how Solanum works. So this has led to a series of monographic works, which a monograph is essentially what it says on the tin. And this is another thing that I gave in this seminar series earlier, is a monograph is everything you know about something, but we're never afraid to ask. So a series of monographs in Solanum has started out. Here are in green are all the groups that are monographed, and in purple are the ones that are left to go. We've also put this monograph online on Solanaceae source, which you can get at through this URL. And one of the other things that's happened recently, and this has been led by Rebecca Hilgenhoff, is to do an online multi-access key to all of those clades within Solanum. So all of those clades that were recognized in that original paper by Lynn and Terry Weiss in the early part of the 2000s, those can now all be keyed out using this key. But more recent work has also, here's an example of the key. So it has lots of characters like geographic distribution, prickles, leaf types and margins, and you can go in and basically you go in and you select what your plant has, and it eliminates things until you get to 2 or 3 things and you can figure out what you have. So please go and play with it and send us back comments on it, because the only way this gets better is if people use it and tell us where they break it, where it doesn't work, or where it works really well. So please go in and use it. And this is Rebecca has been responsible for doing this key, which has been a huge amount of work. More recently, now I'm going to finally get onto the Morelloids. More recently, we've been looking at the phylogeny of Solanum using different cellular compartments and different types of DNA data, because as you notice from that very early phylogeny where I was cutting across with my scissors, there are lots of clades, but we don't really know, we're not really very sure about the relationships between those clades. So in a project led by Edeline Gagnon with Tina again, we looked at the phylogeny of Solanum, looking at traditional Sanger sequencing, whole plastome sequencing, and some angiosperm 353. And this again is a paper which is in press in the American Journal of Botany with loads and loads of authors, and many of you are probably authors on this paper as well. But I want to focus in on this pink bit right here, the M clade. Now, relationships between those clades of non-spiny Solanums, you know, that bit of non-spininess, they actually vary a lot depending on the data used. And I'm not going to go into this because I'm sure Edeline will give a seminar on this earlier, but this is one of these areas where there are what we might consider to be hard polytomies in these data, is that depending on what you look at, you get different kinds of relationships. So untangling this may be something that we just don't necessarily have the tools to do. So here is the M clade, and it's essentially, you can see here, there's lots and lots of these splits here in the non-spiny Solanums. There's lots and lots of intersecting bits of data. So what I'm going to talk about is this M clade. I'm going to talk a little bit about the banans clade and the dulmo clades, the dulcamaroids, but then I'll focus the most on the Morelloids, which are the black nightshades. So this banans clade is a new grouping that Edeline's work pulled out, and this includes a whole bunch of different groups that were there in those non-spiny solanums, but we didn't know the relationships between them. But actually, they now form a very solid monophyletic group. And these include the African non-spiny solanums, which are a group of vining species, most of which occur in Madagascar. And there's a monograph here, which Maria Vorontsova and I did together. They also include things that used to be called the genus Normania, Solanum trisectum, which is from Madeira. These are from Macaronesia, the Madeira and the Canary Islands, including Solanum herculeum, which is a lovely plant from the Straits of Gibraltar at the mouth of the Mediterranean. Also includes a clade of about 11 species of what has traditionally been known as Archisolanum, which are Australian endemics, which are along the southern coast of Australia in wet forests and also in the wet forests of New Guinea. They've been pushed to either side by this drying of the central part of Australia. And a couple of species which I treated as dulcamaroids in 2013 in a monograph, but actually very surprisingly turn out to be part of this other banans clade, which is Solanum valdiviense and Solanum alfonsii, both of which are endemic to Chile, to southern Chile. So that's a really interesting relationship. And I think revisiting that will be fun in the future. The dulcamaroids, or the Solanum dulcamara group, is another one which has been monographed, and I did a monograph of that in 2013. And this is a whole bunch of species which are vines and shrubs and herbaceous vines. And they have a really interesting distribution. They have a set of them are in Eurasia and North America, and another set of them are in Central and South America. So they have an interesting distribution within that particular clade. They're characterized by this kind of very peculiar sleeve into which the pedicel sits. It's almost like a little cup, and the pedicel sits in there. And you can recognize dulcamaroids by that very, very easily. And this is Solanum concarense, which I didn't treat in that monograph in 2013 because I'd never really seen specimens of it. And somebody had suggested it was a Morelloid. But actually, if you look at this pedicel insertion there, this is for sure a dulcamaroid. And sure enough, in Edeline's phylogeny, this comes out as being part of the dulcamaroid clade. So dulcamaroids are cool, and we're adding new things to them and finding new things about them all the time. But I want to focus now on the Morelloid clade, or the Solanum nigrum group. And this is a group which has been bedeviled by its global distribution and its polyploidy and its weedy nature. And there's two monographs of this group. We decided to monograph this group regionally because to do it globally was extremely difficult. And we decided to do it in a way that we did it for the Eastern Hemisphere, for Europe, Asia, and Africa, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. And then for North and Central America and the Caribbean. And the part of this, which is almost finished, is South America. So again, this is work which is the core of this group, although other people come and join with these different monographs, is Gloria Barbosa from Argentina and Tina Sarkinen from Edinburgh. Without them, this would never, ever happen. And in 2015, Tina did a paper looking at the phylogeny of this, which we did with Sanger sequencing. And this is all a bit problematic because there are these polyploids in this group. So we've identified a number of clades, but we know a lot more now. But I'm not going to spoil Tina's story by telling you it now. But black nightshades have very mala fama. They have very bad name. And this is partly because the fruits here look quite a lot like that fruit there, don't they? This is a Tropod belladonna, the deadly nightshade. And in fact, eating a few fruits of a deadly nightshade will make you extremely sick indeed. And if you're a small person, like a child, it can be fatal. Whereas eating the ripe fruits of the Solanum nigrum group, the black nightshades, they're not toxic. And actually people use them in lots of different ways, which I'll explain in a minute. So these are not toxic, these are deadly toxic. So they have this bad name, but actually eating the unripe fruits of many of these species actually can cause problems, poisoning in cattle. And this is partly because they are often weeds of agriculture and get caught up in making silage and hay. So bad, poisonous, not so bad. So as I said earlier, the Morelloid, or maybe I didn't say earlier, that Morelloid clade, just like Solanum, has this completely global worldwide distribution with a concentration of species diversity, in this case, in the Andes, as opposed to in the Andes and southeastern Brazil. And the clade is characterized by a bunch of different things. Is they usually have absolutely minute flowers. The flowers are really small. So in species delimitation in this group, differences between 1 and 2 millimeters in terms of anther length can be the difference between taxa. They also usually have pretty small fruits, and some of the important characters are the ways in which the calyx lobes oppress or don't oppress to the fruit, and also the color of the fruit, which when you're dealing with old herbarium specimens, nobody ever used to write that stuff down. So it's really, really hard to tell. They also, in almost all of the species, have these sclerotic inclusions, sclerified bodies, included in the fruit, mixed in with the seeds in these fleshy fruits. And the numbers of sclerified bodies in each fruit tend to be relatively constant within a species. A species will have none, the whole species will have none. Some will have 2, some have 4, some have 2 to 8, some have more than 15 or 20 in each fruit. So that tends to be pretty constant, not perfect, but it's something that's useful for identifying things. So I'd like to talk about 2 of those groups down there at the 2 of these groups, which are sister lineages to the true black nightshades here. And this is the Solanum radicans group, which has several species in it: Solanum pallitans, tripartitum, and corymbosum, 3 of these species, all of which are South American. And these, again, like Morelloids, have tiny little flowers, but these often have brightly colored fruits. They have red or orange fruits, which often have this kind of constriction across the middle of them. So these are the sister group to all the rest of the Morelloids. The sister group, sequentially sister to that then, is Solanum, is what we call the Episarcophyllum clade, which is a group of species which are all South American, and they're all rhizomatous. So they have this rhizome which lives deep in sandy soil. And what people often would do is pull the plants out, and so would describe things based on their size without realizing that it was actually the time of year at which they collected them was what the size depended on. So working with that has been quite challenging, and also means one of those things that we've done in the field a lot. And then sister then to the rest of the nightshades is Solanum triflorum, which is an amphitropical weed. Now, amphitropical distributions are really interesting. These are those taxa which grow in southern South America and in the western part of the United States, southwest US up into Canada. So this is a classic amphitropical distribution, and the hypotheses for how plants got there have to do with bird distribution, and sometimes these taxa are considered to be introduced weeds in North America, but not in South America. But I actually we think that these are not introduced into North America, that this is actually a true amphitropical distribution. So now I want to pass to the black nightshades themselves. And I'm going to do these in the order in which we did them in our monographs, because I'm not going to talk in great detail about any of the phylogenetics, but more about how these groups of black nightshades in different parts of the world differ in how they're perceived, and also how they're used by people, and also in the kinds of distributions they have. So if we look at Africa, there's a whole clade of these black nightshades, which we call the African polyploids. Now, these are all either tetraploids or hexaploids, and they're all occurring in Africa and Europe. So this is an interesting thing, and Peter Poxai in the University of Helsinki has been working on trying to unravel what the parentage of these allopolyploids are. So they seem to be allopolyploids that have allopolyploids of autotetraploids, and it's very, very complicated, and Peter's working that out using some very sophisticated molecular techniques. But in Africa, there are a number of species, and all of these are polyploid, and they're very, very much used over the entire continent. Now they're used, this is Manoko, who did his PhD on some of these taxa at the University of Nijmegen in the Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And he looked a lot at these, at the polyploidy, and looked at the relationships within those using techniques like AFLPs. He described the species Umalilaense, which he collected from cultivation in the very south part of Tanzania, but it's also known from Zambia. And this may be a cultigen, but we're really not sure. It's a very, very interesting species. So this is Solanum scabrum, which is a hexaploid, and Solanum scabrum has two basic kinds of plants in Africa. It's really not known outside of cultivation. There are wild populations, or what we think are wild populations, but it's very, very commonly cultivated, both for its berries, which are extremely large. They're about this big around. They're the size of small cherries, and for its leaves. Solanum villosum, which is a plant also of Europe, has bright orange fruits, one of the very few of the black nightshade clade that has these bright orange fruits. And in Africa, there are many populations which have these very multi-branched inflorescences that have these bright orange fruits that taste delicious. Some of them taste like wild strawberries. And I'll talk about that, how they got to be like that in a minute. There is Solanum tardi remotum, which is a plant of high elevations. It occurs from across the Eastern Arc and down into South Africa. That's used again also for its leaves. And Solanum retroflexum, which is a plant of Southern Africa. South Africa, there's an entire jam industry based on Solanum retroflexum and Solanum scabrum. So it's a really important fruit for making jams of. The fruits of all of these are edible. The fruits of all of these are edible. They're edible cooked. They're also edible raw. And Tina ran a taste testing in Edinburgh, where people actually found Solanum nigrum, the European Solanum nigrum, the best tasting. I'm not sure I really agree with that, but people eat these fruits. They need to be ripe though before you eat them. So those Solanum villosum varieties, which have lots and lots of very many branched inflorescences, in the wild around the Mediterranean, they don't tend to have the multi-branched inflorescences. And people think that this is possibly due to selection by children, who tend to go for those plants that have the many, many fruits, because it's the children who gather the fruits of these species, at least in East Africa, for sure. But more important than the fruits of these species of black nightshades in Africa are the leaves, because they're a very important pot herb that people use in cooking, because they're very high in vitamin C. They have a lot of vitamin A. They're very, very good for people's nutrition. And this is true of a lot of the traditional pot herbs of Europe, of Africa, have passed out of use because of canned vegetables and things coming in from Europe and the Americas. But actually these traditional crops, which are grown as vegetables, are much better nutritionally than many of the things that are imported. You can see a few tomatoes there as well. And in Hainan, China, when I was collecting, I came across this woman who was cultivating Solanum americanum, which is a circumtropical weedy plant. And she was cultivating it for its fruits. And so this is, in a way, it's kind of incipient domestication, but it's also very, very widely used in China as a stir-fry vegetable. So in the Eastern Hemisphere clade of the black nightshades, actually, all of these plants are very, very widely used by people throughout their range, not so much in Europe, but in places where people are much more connected with their local environment. And actually, in Spain and Italy, people have told me that their grandmothers used to use these as pot herbs as well. So the next monograph we did was of North and Central America. Now, in North America, these plants are largely regarded as weeds of agriculture. And one of our problems with treating these plants in North America was the fact that they were all called Solanum nigrum. Every single one of the collections of all of these taxa, all across the United States, was called Solanum nigrum. So looking at images of specimens and figuring out how to tell these parts was a real challenge. This picture is of Solanum emulans, but actually in North America, North and Central America, there are a number of species of much smaller distribution. Actually, all of these have relatively large distributions, but they're completely different, and their ranges do overlap as well. So they can be quite challenging to tell apart. It's also true that one of the really interesting things about these is you can track the change in their distribution from the eastern part of the United States. Solanum emulans is the species which was always called Solanum americanum in the northeastern part of the US. You can look at the collections of that, and they go along the Trans-Canada Railway until they get to Vancouver. Solanum emulans doesn't occur anywhere in the western part of the United States, but it does occur in Vancouver. and is certain, almost certainly got there from the railways. One of the super interesting things that I'd love to investigate one day is that there's traditional Solanum nigrum on the west coast of the United States, in Canada and California, and going into Montana. And there's also traditional Solanum nigrum on the east coast of the United States. Now, I think there's probably been two introductions, one from people from Europe, and the second of which in the western part of the United States, possibly came across on the Bering Straits. And so it is from a completely different set of populations, but that needs us to do lots of field work in what used to be the Soviet Union and is now Russia, and the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, and figuring out all of those different things about the plants of that. It'd be a great population genetic study one day. But a narrow endemic, Solanum pseudogracile, is from the southern part of the United States, and Solanum pruinosum is also a relatively narrow endemic in Mexico. So contrary to the kind of weedy paradigm, which has always been the case, is, oh, it's another Solanum nigrum. Actually, there's a number of species of these in North and Central America and the Caribbean, but telling them apart can be pretty challenging. And the last of these monographs that we're doing is the South American, is the South American taxa. Oh, I forgot to say there are about 16 species in the Eastern Hemisphere monograph. There are about 19 species in the North and Central American monograph, and there are almost 65 in the South American monograph. So this is where the diversity is. And these are plants of the Andes, as you saw from the global distribution map. And they're hugely variable. They're hugely variable. Some of them are exceedingly widely distributed, like Solanum aloisifolium and Solanum tweedianum. But others of them are relatively narrow endemics, like Solanum guayavillense or Solanum annuum. Solanum annuum is a tiny little annual. Solanum guayavillense has yellow flowers, one of the few occurrences of yellow flowers outside the tomatoes in Solanum. They're teeny weeny little ones like Solanum wedellii. There are fantastic cup-shaped ones with corollas that are campanulate. So the diversity within this part of the Morelloid clade is quite extreme. There's also Solanum silicifolium, which is part of this clade, which I treated as a dulcamaroid because it was a little shrub. So it just goes to show that first impressions can be wrong. So this has been a really fun one to do, and we're nearly at the end of this. We're starting to figure out how to write the key for the monograph. So the keys are always challenges in monographic works, because one of the things about monographic works is when you publish them, people want you to have dichotomous keys. But in the case of these plants, these multi-access keys work much, much better, because many of these taxa have characters that overlap. Some of them have very tiny differences. Some of them are so variable that they'll come out many, many times in a dichotomous key, no matter what characters you use. So actually, what Rebecca did as part of her project, looking at the non-spiny solanums, is she wrote a multi-access key, which is again available on Solanaceae source. You go to the tab that says identification keys, and you can find that key, which is a key to all of the non-spiny species of Solanum, and it includes all the minor groups in all of those clades listed there, including the Morelloids. So that's a really good place to start for a key, and I'm sure that's where we're going to start for our key, to try to write our key for the monograph. So Rebecca's done a great job doing those keys. But new things happen all the time. And back in Cordoba, working with Gloria in the herbarium, we found all kinds of new distributions of things and also new taxa. Now I just want to show you a few of these exciting new species that we found recently, which increase the diversity of this clade enormously. One of these is called Solanum tinae, which is called Solanum tinae because Tina Sarkinen found it. She found it and she said, this looks different. And Gloria and I said, no, it's got to be this other thing. Well, sure enough, she was absolutely right. It's different, and it's now called Solanum tinae. It has quite interesting flowers that go from a kind of creamy yellow through white to darker purple as they mature. So this business of the color in flowers of Solanum is quite interesting. We've had quite a number of seminars in the series about flower color in different clades of Solanum, but Solanaceae. But in Solanum, there's often changes in flower color through the life of a flower, which is quite interesting in terms of signaling to pollinators, but also interesting in terms of how that develops. Solanum tinae is a woody plant which grows in kind of disturbed areas. And plants can also grow in places where people don't really like to collect. People really love to collect in beautiful cloud forests on the slopes of the Andes, or in lovely high montane areas, or in the tropical rainforest. But in these highly anthropogenic landscapes like this one in La Pampa in Argentina, people often aren't really that interested in collecting. But actually, there's a lot of interesting things in the remnant forests which occur here. And one of these is Solanum marmaratum, which Gloria and I described quite recently. Has, again, tiny little flowers, but it has these super interesting marbled fruits. And these fruits, Gloria picked these. This was in Argentina right before the world slammed shut with the pandemic. Gloria picked these and they stayed moist on her desk for 4 months and didn't dry out. So there's something pretty special going on about the cuticle of these really interesting fruits. They never turn any other color than this dark green with this marbling, which is why we've called it Solanum marmaratum. So there's something pretty special going on there. But you know, all of this depends upon specimen collection, specimen curation in herbaria to make those available to people like Gloria, Tina, me, Rebecca, people who need to access these specimens to look at characteristics. And this is a quote that I always use from Robbie Hart's paper from 2014, is that actually now in this era of rapid environmental change, you know, these collections are more important now than they ever have been, but they're important now for other things than just taxonomy. So they're important for understanding long-term change and for supporting conservation. So that means we need to think about collecting, curation, but also making data available, openly available to people who need it. So I just want to leave you with one little tiny thing. 2 weeks ago, I went to the Glasgow Climate Conference. I went as part of a Natural History Museum delegation. We gave talks and did all kinds of fun things. But I just want to this kind of has gone off the edge of the screen, I think. But this is something that came out of the Glasgow Climate Pact. And I think this is, no matter who we are or what we do, all of us here love plants and all of us here love nature. And this is what has come out of the Glasgow Climate Pact, is it emphasizes the importance of protecting, conserving, and restoring nature and ecosystems, and by protecting biodiversity. Now, this is the very first time that biodiversity or nature has ever appeared in a climate conference pact from the UN climate conferences. And I've heard it cynically said to me the other night that, oh, by 2027, it'll all be gone. Nobody will remember about nature. So it's each one of ours responsibility to push nature, biodiversity, protection and restoration of nature, and understanding biodiversity as key elements of addressing what we have as a climate emergency in the world today. So I think the fact that it's in there is really, really important. And all of us who love biodiversity and love nature need to recognize the importance of that. And you know, even if you have a tiny voice, your voice can be heard. So make that voice heard in terms of helping with climate change, but also helping with biodiversity. So just to leave you with that little preachy bit. And I want to thank all those people who've given me funding throughout the years and all those people who have helped, who I thanked at the very beginning. But I'd like to thank them again here now. But today, and especially today, I want to have a special thanks to those amazing organizers of this seminar series, which has been incredibly exciting. I've learned so much about the Solanaceae that I never knew happened. That's Rosia Diana, Chelsea Pretz, Andres Orejuela, Luke Wheeler, and Rebecca Hilgenhoff, who've really organized this seminar series amazingly. So I think we should all give them a round of applause, because this has been a great seminar series, and can't wait to see everybody next year. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'd welcome any questions. So well done, everybody, the organizers. Yay!
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you guys for organizing this. It's been great. It's been absolutely fantastic.
I'm very sorry that I missed part of the talk. I had a doctor appointment, but now I'm here. So if
excellent.
There's some... Yeah.
It was all kind of normal stuff, Rosia. It was all the normal kind of thing.
Okay, yes, I'm going to watch this talk, of course, then in YouTube. So then we have the first question.
Richard has a question.
So yes, exactly. So
Richard, you always have questions.
Well, curious minds want to know.
You bet.
That was a great talk. Thank you. I always enjoy getting brought up to date on work that's going on Solanum, since I don't track it as closely as I should as it's coming out. But there were a couple things that caught my ear. One, I'll just relay as a comment. You talked about how deadly poisonous Atropobelladonna fruits are. And I think that's a bit of a overstatement. Only because my grandson ate several fruits of that I had set aside to harvest seeds from. And I was so concerned that I called the poison hotline and took him down to the local fire department, which is where the poison center is in our area. And the guys there looked it up and they were totally blasé. Said, oh, no problem. He probably won't even get sick from eating 4 or 5 of those fruits. So I think it takes more to be.
Yeah, because there's old literature, there's old European literature from the old European medicinal literature about it being poisonous.
Yeah,
so it may be that
right.
there's different populations, and
that could be.
I mean, it like tobacco has different levels of nicotine in its different populations. So that's pretty cool.
I had harvested some fruits off a plant on campus in our medicinal herb garden to try to germinate some seeds to grow at home. And we had also, at the same time, we had blueberries ripe in our garden.
Yeah.
And he had been picking and eating blueberries, and he saw these in a bowl in my office and just wolfed them down. But my question to you, the thing that caught my ear also was about the Solanum valdiviense, the Chilean species. You said came out in this group unexpectedly. And I'm wondering if it is related to the Australian and Southeast Asian ones. And the reason I ask that is that we just published a paper on Bignoniaceae, where there's this monotypic genus in the Valdivian rainforest in Chile called Campsidium valdivianum that is itself has its ancestry in Australian bignones. Tina was a co-author on this with one of my grad students because it includes Tacoma, which she had worked on for her PhD. But it's a group, the Bignoniaceae originated in South America like Solanaceae did, spread to other parts of the world. And this is the one species of Bignoniaceae that's made it back to South America from Eastern Hemisphere ancestors. I thank you for that. We had in our museum, we had this big, long discussion about Old World, New World, and whether we should be using those terms or not. It was very
well, we've had this big, long discussion as well, and we've settled on Eastern Hemisphere spinies.
That's a good conclusion, because we tried to think of, how do you contrast the Americas, for instance, with the Old World or the Eastern Hemisphere, because there's so many different elements to that.
There's too many continents, and having an acronym is just mad. So
Australians don't like to be thought of as Old World. They prefer to be thought of as New World.
No, I know, and it also new and old is the value.
Western Hemisphere. So yeah. So at any rate, what's the relationship of that Solanum valdiviense?
Okay, I just have this slide, and so what happens in that banans clade is that Valdiviense and Alphonsii are each other's buds, and then and they are sister to Imamensi, which is one of the Malagasy ones. We don't have many of the Malagasy ones.
Yeah.
Xavier Obrio has been looking at finding time and looking at extracting DNA out of those herbarium specimens, just to see, that group of kind of 11 species that's only in Madagascar, and then this massively widespread job in Africa. And then there's a kind of polytomy at the base, which has Solanum laciniatum and Solanum trisectum.
Which are Australian.
Yeah, no, laciniatum is Australian and trisectum is Madeira.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay.
So there's something going on there, and I think there are more species. I mean, there are more species in that blob of things. That's what I mean, is that from this amazing study that Edeline did with Tina, we can now kind of drill into those and say, okay, let's sample some more in this area to get to
So how many examples do you think there are of Western Hemisphere species that owe their ancestry to Eastern Hemisphere species in Solanum?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. What is interesting though in Solanum, because I haven't really thought about it with respect to the kind of non-spiny Solanums, but with the spiny Solanums, which I didn't talk about, but Susie's paper is about, and I think I talked about it once before in this series, is that clade of Eastern Hemisphere spinies, they're a completely monophyletic group, totally monophyletic group.
And none of them have made it back to the Western Hemisphere.
No.
Yeah.
Nope. Nope. Because that whole group is monophyletic, and there's no real kind of dots of American things in there.
Mhm.
But there are dots of Eastern Hemisphere clade, Eastern Hemisphere distributions within the largely American clades.
Yeah, just it made me curious about whether and how often things that are of New World origin have dispersed and diversified outside of outside of the Western Hemisphere, and then made it back.
Yeah, I tend to use Americas. I use Americas because there's lots of them. But yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I think the more and more we go into Solanum, the more and more interesting it gets. And the work that Chris Martin and his group are doing on the Australian ones is fascinating as well, because within Australia, there's this big kind of diversification thing going on. But how is that going on within Australia? That's really interesting as well. It's kind of not Morelloids, but Morelloids are just everywhere. Everybody collects them. That's the problem.
Weeds.
Well, I know they're. I mean,
Dulcamara and nigrum.
Everybody collects them. Everybody collects them because they're easy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, Stacy has a question. Stacy said she has a question.
But first, there are a lot of congratulations for your talk from Loretta Freitas, Isabella Rodriguez, Lucy, Maria Fatima Agra, Pat Berry-Herd, as well Kian Ningun Van, Milo Pine, Gloria, of course, and Stacy has a question. So I'm giving the word to her.
Go, Stacy.
Okay, and I apologize, my phone's so bad. Oh, it's so fun to wake up to a Sandy talk. Like, what could be better than that? And it's so funny because I was just talking to someone yesterday about all of the vegetative diversity of Solanum, and I just forget how diverse the flowers are. So thank you.
It's quite cool, isn't it? I mean, they are kind of more or less the same, aren't they? But not.
They are, but then there's so much variation in the size and the amount of reflexing and the color change. And anyway, I think it's easy for me to forget that actually there is quite a lot of variation, but that's not my question.
Okay.
my question is more that I was fascinated about this story of all the things that were just determined as Solanum nigrum in the US, and that there was these other species diversity under there. And I guess I was curious about, you said they're hard to tell apart. Sort of what are the characters that hint to you that this isn't, what are the characters that define these different things? And I also wondered if, this is the Franco question, I'm asking the Franco question because for him, are there ploidy differences across those species?
Yes, there are. The short answer is yes, there are ploidy differences. Sometimes not. There are quite a few diploids in North America. The real ploidy differences are in the Eastern Hemisphere, particularly in Africa. There's lots of ploidy differences. But in North America, the differences, the main differences are, so in the monograph, we did a key to each region. So we did a key to Central America, we did a key Mexico and Central America, and then we did a key to the United States and Canada, and we did a key to the Caribbean. And the things that differentiate the taxa are the length of the anthers, and sometimes it's really important, the difference between that there's a ratio between the length of the anthers and the length of the filaments. So sometimes the filaments are as long as the anthers, and sometimes they're shorter, and that I think can make a big difference in the resin in how things get pollinated, because it means that you have different pollen extrusion because of the different filaments, that it sets up a different vibration frequency. And then the other difference, which is important, is the number of stone swells in the fruits, the colors of the fruits, and whether the calyx flips back or sits down over the top of the berry.
Well, I'm going to pay attention.
Vegetatively, they just look the same, and you collect them in a hurry, and they've got little white flowers, and they've got kind of, and the fruits being shiny or not is important as well. That's been really important in in the Pacific, actually, where you get two incredibly widespread taxa, one of which is hexaploid and one of which is diploid. But the hexaploid has fruits that aren't shiny and has the calyx kind of coming down over the top of the fruit. Not kind of accrescent or anything, but just kind of hugging it at the base. And the other is Solanum americanum, which has super shiny fruits and the calyx always flips back.
That is so interesting. I was just talking about this sort of strange matte fruits that are in Sustrum, and how, you know, it's just sort of a character that I hadn't paid much attention to, but is really, because I guess because mostly in Iochroma, they're all the same. There's nothing matte looking, but that's so interesting about this.
Yeah, and Solanum reflexiflorum, the South African one, retroflexum. I'm thinking about spiny solanums right now, but so Solanum retroflexum, which is the South African species, has very, very matte fruits, and they're quite large. What's interesting is the African species, the taxa in Africa, which are used, none of them have stone cells in their fruits. So all the species that are used for fruit don't have stone cells in their fruits. So a lot of that has to be human selection.
Yeah, I was going to say that makes all the sense. And do you know, is that matte appearance? I'm going to have to go back and take a close look the next time I run into one of these. Do you think it's a wax? If you zoom in on it,
it doesn't look, you can't rub it off. You can't really rub it off.
So
it's interesting though, but the Solanum retroflexum is the Wonderberry, is the Burbank, is the Luther Burbank thing.
Yes. You can actually buy seeds of it here, and I've been meaning to purchase it to have some more tasty berries in my yard. So we'll see how it does.
They're really good. They're delicious.
Okay,
but they're always very matte, and they look almost glaucous, but it isn't wax. There's something different going on. There's something really interesting about the cuticles of these fleshy berried fruited solanums, because some of them are shiny and some of them are not.
So interesting. All right, I'm gonna take a look at it at some point.
They're also laxatives, apparently. They're bird laxatives as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you for mentioning that as well before I plant a bunch and eat myself silly enough.
But you're not a bird, Stacy, so it doesn't matter.
Do we know that? Anyway. That was so fun, Sandy. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Because I just thought I would just talk about what I'm thinking about,
I think that's the way to go, and show us lots of pretty pictures and fun stories. I mean, what could be better?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll let other people take over. And yes, also thanks to the organizers. This is something I look forward to every week, and I have learned so much.
Well, thank you very much, Stacy.
Questions?
Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you very much, Stacy and Sandy. Lynn is saying that yes, that she just got here, that it's screwed up the time again. And
Milo.
she's going to watch it. And the same happened to some of people. Yes, there is Lynn. And to some people like Greg Anderson and not Loretta Freitas, but I saw someone else that was joining just now.
Okay, Milo's asked a question.
Milo has
asked a question about emulans versus americanum.
Yeah,
they're actually, once you get your eye in, they're super easy to tell apart. So americanum will have two stone cells in the fruits, and these super shiny fruits and the calyces which flip back. And emulans has matte fruits and the calyces go down, and it has more than 5 stone cells in the fruits. And
okay,
usually,
that's good.
But usually, and this is, and so of course, this is always usually, because there's always an exception to the rule. Usually, the filaments are longer in relation to the anthers in emulans than they are in americanum. And the other thing that always looks to me, but I'm not. Tina and I couldn't agree on this, so we didn't put it in the key. But is that the calyx lobes always are sort of they're sort of longer and thinner, and they're often unequal. There's sort of one of them is often slightly longer than the others.
In which one?
That's not always true.
In which one they're uneven?
Emulans,
okay.
They're longer and thinner. Americanum has stubby, cute ones, whereas emulans has kind of longer, cute ones.
I think most of what we have is emulans, but I'm always looking at for Americanum.
So where are you, Milo?
North Carolina.
You'll have both. You'll have both, and you'll have Solanum pseudograssulae as well.
Yes, out on the coast. Yep. Yep, in the dunes. So,
And
so
that's-
one time I ran into a name, I believe it was Solanum nigrum variety Virginianum.
That's Solanum emulans.
Oh, okay,
That was
good.
never properly published.
Okay.
Well, actually, it was published by Linnaeus, but what
Yeah.
that is Solanum emulans.
Okay, very good. All right. Thank you so much. That's
You're
excellent.
so welcome.
I appreciate it.
That's great. Thank you, Milo. And it's great to see you around here. Yes, such a long time. Okay, so there is no other questions, but I actually have a question, even that I didn't watch the talk yet, because
Hey, that's
I
not
was
fair.
I was wondering that you recently described some Solanum here from Argentina, and how many species do you think, or approximately about that still need to be described in Solanum?
Well, that's always the $64,000 question, isn't it? And it kind of depends on what you're going to call a species as well.
Yes.
But they estimate so if you look across all of angiosperms, we've probably described between 80 to 85% of species. So there's probably 20% of species of Solanum of angiosperms left to describe. So that's probably true for Solanum as well.
Okay. Perfect.
You know, I think there's quite a lot of diversity out there. There are sad cases where people describe things that are actually just synonyms and become synonyms straight away because they haven't, you know, looked broadly enough, which is why it's really hard in Solanum when there's so many species. It's really, really hard, which is why that, you know, with the project that Lynn had from NSF a long time ago that we all participated in is trying to put this all online so that there's actually a resource there that people can use to compare stuff to try to make it so that it's as available as possible. That's why I always publish all those monographs in open access journals as well.
That's great. Yeah, that's a great idea. And also, yes, I think I will never publish a new Solanum species because it's so hard to go through and analyze all the species first. It's impossible.
But I think what's great about what's great about what Rebecca did is that key to the clades allows you to get to a clade with something, and then that gives you a slightly smaller universe to kind of have to deal with, which is why having that key to clades is so useful.
But that's good to identify a species, but to describe a new one, you need to revise all the old names as well. So it's kind of,
you might not have to revise all the old names if it's something that somebody's monographed quite recently.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So if like in the Morelloids, we've kind of dealt with a massive kind of backlog of ghastly nomenclature, which we reckon we do it once and that's it, you know, because it's really, really gnarly. But you know, so it kind of depends, but it also kind of depends on whether you agree with the way a person, say me, has delimited things. So I mean, and we've changed our minds. Gloria and Tina and I have changed our minds appallingly over the course of the time that we've been working, because we used to think that Solanum coachobabedzi was the same thing as Solanum aloisifolium, but then we realized that maybe it wasn't, and then we had to pull them out, and then we thought they were something else, and then we thought they were maybe 5 things, and then we thought they were 2. So we just keep changing our mind, and it's partly because the boundaries of these things are not very clear. You know, it's not as like Solanum marmaratum is easy. But some of the other ones, it's really hard to tell where one thing you can call a species begins and another ends, and you can't call it all the same thing. It just is pointless.
Yeah.
And when they're wide distributions, I mean, everybody says, why can't you use DNA? Well, you could, except many of these things have really big distributions. And so that means you need to sample across the whole distribution to all of its edges. And you know, so it's tricky. So you do the best you can with what you have, and just leave it, you know. So my view about monographs is my success. So my impact for having written a monograph is that somebody describes something new in that group, because that means they've used my monograph.
That's amazing. Yes. And before the question, that there is another question from Richard. I want to ask you this very quick question: is when you are writing a monograph, when do you say stop? This is ready to publish.
I say stop when I get bored. Well, actually, because I have a very low boredom threshold, and so basically I sort of say stop when when it's good enough. Because if you think about so think about sequencing a genome. So when they sequenced the human genome, they published it as finished when it was 80% done. So that last 20% is really hard to do. So for example, in some of these taxa, which have, like Solanum nigrum has like pages and pages of synonyms. And I didn't find types for all of them because there's no point, because they're described from German floras. There's no specimens have ever been associated with any of this. So I just put them in synonymy and said type not located. And it just isn't, it's just not worth it. I guess it's partly kind of, I just kind of think, is the payoff in terms of more information going to be good for this? Spending weeks and weeks figuring this out, or is it going to be not worth it? It's just, I guess you stop when it's good enough.
Okay. That's
But
right.
I'm pretty much Lynn will say I'm a total perfectionist and kind of get things I'm quite perfectionist.
Yes, I'm always trying to make it better. That monograph will say.
Well, the thing is, you always can. You always can, because if you publish it, it doesn't mean you stop thinking about it.
Yeah.
So publishing is like a snapshot. It's like a cut through a tree. It's like having a phylogenetic tree as a cut through a tree, and we see the tips, but we don't. There's other stuff going on that we maybe don't know about.
Continues.
Yeah,
exactly. So Richard, yes, you have a question. Thank you, Sandy.
Thanks. I'm reminded in that last discussion about the old expression that any fool can tell what's perfect, but it takes real skill to know what's good enough.
I'm not sure I have that, but I try hard.
So my question is about the amphitropic disjunctions that you mentioned with Solanum triflorum. That's been a topic that I've been very interested in over the years, and have studied some groups that have that kind of disjunction. And my prefacing comment is that most of the historical literature talking about these amphitropic disjunctions lump together all of the North America and South America disjunctions. But if you look at them separately with the coastal disjuncts, say from California to Chile, those are almost all North America to South America.
Yeah.
But if you look at the interior ones from the desert zone, say in Argentina to Mexico and the desert Southwest of North America, they're almost all South America to North America.
Yeah.
But there's a real different pattern between them. And if you lump them all together, it sort of loses, that pattern gets lost. And it's the triflorum would be in the latter category, South America to North America. It's something I think would be really worthy of a significant review, to look at that south to north one. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago looking at this in Verbenaceae, and postulated.
Yeah, you did it in that. There was that American Journal of Botany kind of whole volume with those.
Right.
Yeah.
And my postulate there is that north to south has always been explained by the coastal distributions, by coastal seabirds that make those big migrations. But there is no such comparable bird migration between the interior deserts. And so my suggestion there was that from south to north, you can have migration up the Andes jumping from xeric area to xeric area until you get to about Ecuador. And then you have
where do you go? Yeah.
Then you have to make a leap to Mexico, where you've got a big target to hit, because there's a lot of arid land in Mexico. But going the other way around, if you were arid land species in Mexico trying to make it to South America, you'd have to hit one of those little arid spots in the Andes, which would be very difficult to do. And then stepping stone migration or something down. I mean, there's other explanations. Who knows what the
but I think there could also be kind of differential extinction. I mean, it's a tricky one, and the thing about Solanum triflorum is it just grows everywhere. I mean, it's just it's like I mean, I can't believe it kind of jumped up the Andes and didn't persist, because it
it's
grow everywhere.
Yeah, so that we were specifically looking for an Andean signature of these disjunctions between North and South America, and we found it in Verbena, but not in say Aloysia or Citharexlum, I think was the other one that we were looking at.
Yeah. Well,
But all of them originated from the
Triflorum is
south.
super interesting. I mean, they really are. I mean, it's interesting because it's the sister to the rest of the black nightshades. So people
Yeah.
always used to put it with the episarcophyllums, you know, with those kind of fleshy things with kind of pinnate-ish leaves, but it's quite different. I mean, the flowers are quite different, but it's sister to all the rest of the black nightshades.
Yeah, so it has an old history and may well have had a very different distribution in the past.
Yeah, and what I think is really interesting as well is, so if you look at those, the other big kind of amphitropical, you know, the kind of obvious amphitropical distribution in Solanum is Solanum elagnifolium, which is another kind of expanding weed of agriculture. And that one is sister, Solanum elagnifolium and its friends are sister to all of the Eastern Hemisphere spinies. So again, this kind of very small species poor group being sister to this massive radiation.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
it's cool.
Well, that's great. Yes, well, there is a comment of Lynn. I don't know if you want to say something, Lynn, about that comment.
Sure, I will, and I'm so sorry that I'm an hour late, but hello, everybody. Sandy, I will watch your talk as soon as it's posted. And I just wanted to emphasize how important it is that the Black Nightshade group has straightened out the nomenclature of some of these species, like just straightening out the nomenclature of Solanum nigrum and emulans really helps us to advance. So the rest of us, I mean, Rocio, you're saying how hard it is to go through the old literature and figure out what's been done and what's been described. But for us to not have to go and reinvent the wheel now of all the names that have been applied under Solanum nigrum or some of the cultivated Solanums is a huge advance. So thank you to you Black Nightshades ladies. This is amazing. And I'll be using these treatments until I die for sure.
Well, I hope the keys work, that's all.
I also should mention that Sandy and I got together
Ooh, look.
a little while ago, and so we did the Flora North America treatment for Solanum, and this parallels the Black Nightshade treatment that these guys have published. So we all got together and agreed on the species in North America, and all these treatments should be parallel, which will help other people to use them.
And we did the same for Argentina when we had the, because we did the treatment for Argentina in 2013. And when I was in Argentina, just before the pandemic struck, we were saying, well, these need to be changed and this needs to be changed. And they said, well, we have to wait until you publish something. And we thought, well, you know, let's just do. So we published the new taxa, Solanum marmaratum, Tina E, and then another one, which we described, which is named for Armando Hunsaker, Solanum hunsackeri. And then we published a new key, and we talked about all the name changes that had happened and this terrible mistake we made with the kind of types of these two things, which is classic, you know, because we just didn't know them as well in 2013, and then published a key to all of the the Morelloids from Argentina, which now means that all of the websites that go with the Darwinian and the Flora of the Cono Sur and all that use the new names and the new concepts. So yeah, so sometimes, you know, we were thinking, well, we can't really wait till the monograph because that might take us a while. So we thought, oh, we'll just do it this way.
Well, thank you, Lynn and Sandy. There is also a comment of Richard Olmsted that he is saying that he loves the concept of the random access to keys to clades. I'm going to check that out. We use them for white flower identification in our smartphone app here in Washington. So yeah, I have seen the key with Rebecca, that it's entirely awesome. I hope that eventually it's going to be available for the entire Solanum and not just for a particular clades and going to clades. So that
well, that's Rebecca's next thing is to do that, isn't it, Rebecca?
Rebecca, yes, that I mean, it's a lot of work. Rebecca is there, yeah. She was going to say something.
Yeah, I'm there. No, I was going to say that we're extending it to all non-spiny, so another 308 species, which should cover half the genus soon.
Yeah, so the spinies, it's only the spinies which are left, which are tricky. Xavier and I are just finishing, because Xavier Obrio gave a seminar earlier in the series about the spiny ones, didn't he? And we just are finalizing that monograph to submit. And we have a key in there of there's 38 native species and 11 non-native introduced ones. And he just pointed out to me yesterday on the phone that actually I made this giant mistake in lead number 6, which means I'm going to have to kind of go in and renumber all of the couplets, which is so irritating, but never mind. It's my fault.
Well, thank you very much, Sandy. As everyone has said, thank you. This has been very interesting, very amazing talk, interesting plans. So thank you very much for giving this last talk. Thank you all the organizers and all my colleagues that have been helping me, cover me. Thank you, Luke, for today. Like I was so late. And well, next year, this is the last seminar of this season. So next year we are starting on the 21st of January with Tina Sarkinen giving a talk that we are going to say very soon the title and also the new schedule for next year. So thank you, Luke. I'm seeing you there. And thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rocio.
Andy.
Thanks, and Luke as well. Thank you very much. And have a lovely end of 2021.
Thanks,
Yes,
Sandy. You
that's
too.
the same for everyone.
Bye.
Bye.